we as individuals do that. But there's another place where small thinking comes into play that is also very detrimental to ministry, and that's in the places where we serve. Now, for me, that's been a congregation. And I use the word congregation to talk about any kind of faith community, organized faith communities. So whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, if you're not Christian, I'm referring to your kind of faith community as well. I want to show you how this can sometimes show up. The very first congregation I served, actually two congregations, were small rural congregations, and a total of about 300 members between the two of them. And I was there for probably, by the time this came up, about 5 years, which meant I was already there longer than any pastor had stayed continually. They were what many people call starter congregations, which in the Lutheran Church meant that they'd get a pastor probably right out of seminary who would stay maybe 3 to 5 years and then move on. And so they were used to going and developing a relationship and developing a ministry in 3 to 5 year chunks, mostly around 3 or so years. And since I was there about 5 years at that point in time with the one congregation, I was thinking, and I wasn't planning on leaving at that point, and I didn't leave for about another 2.5 years. And I got to thinking, the members of this congregation are getting older. I was in the upper Midwest, so that meant there was winter, which we had to deal with. And the congregation in question of these two was built in such a way that there were, if you see in a lot of the movies where you have a church, typical white church building with steps going up the front to get in. Well, that's kind of what this was like. And they had 10 steps, as I remember, one for each of the 10 commandments perhaps, but there were 10 of them. And they were fairly steep outside. And in wintertime, they could get a little bit slippery, or even with rain at any time of the year. And every time there was a funeral and I saw people bring a casket in or carry it out up and down those stairs, I got worried that somebody was going to fall and something was going to happen. And the members were getting older and they were having a harder time coming up those stairs to get into the building too. And so I started suggesting to the church council, was what we called the board, that they do some long-range planning and think about putting it in an elevator that was big enough to carry a casket. And I got all this pushback. And it was like, what's going on? And it wasn't the issue of the elevator necessarily, but it was that they just really didn't even want to think about something long term, long range. It was like, why do we want to think about that? What's the point? And I didn't understand it at the time because it felt like I was just kept hitting my head against a brick wall. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I realized what was going on. And it was this pattern that they were in that had put their thinking inside of a box, as I'll call it, where we do this much and go this far with any pastor, and then, that pastor leaves. And we start all over again and go this far, and then that pastor leaves. And it was like they didn't have a sense of identity about who they are and what they could do on their own. It was always waiting for the pastor to lead them and to do something. And so they had just this mental set that kept them thinking very small about the possibilities of who they were and what they could do. and what was possible for them. And that mindset that they had just, it prevented them from moving. It prevented them from doing all kinds of things. Just because, oh, we're a small congregation. Oh, our pastor leaves, you know, any of that kind of thing, just, we can't do this. If your congregation has ever said, oh, we can't do that. We tried this. You ever heard that one? We tried this once before and it didn't work. Which to some people means that forever and ever, amen, it will never work. Nothing even close to that will work. But that keeps people thinking small. Sometimes it's convenient because then they don't have to do a lot of work. But it also raises a question of, what are your values? What are the things we say we value as people of faith? And it was not something I knew at that time and have actually learned in more recent years. The power of noticing and actually being very intentional about listing my values. And I'm going to talk more about that as individually a little bit later. But we need to do that, to make a list of our own values. And when I did that, I noticed one of the things that I value a lot is nature. And, you know, these beautiful flowers. Being around a place where I can see trees and there's grass and there's birds. Being able to easily be in nature and one with nature is a value that's near and dear to me. And another value that's near and dear to me because of my faith is diversity. You know, there's a beautiful variety of flowers here. Absolutely beautiful. It would be beautiful if it was all the same kind, but the beauty is accelerated in a sense by all the different, you know, the different colors and the different varieties of flowers. And that's the same is true with us as people, accepting that diversity. And so as much as it's important for us individually to list our values, and I said we'll do some more of that later, but for a faith community, a congregation, also it's very powerful for them to list their values. Many of these values are things and expectations that are there, the hidden ones, you know, that we don't really recognize, and you kind of run up against when you suggest something like putting in an elevator. You know, and what are those values? They're often implied, and the ones that, you know, each individual has, they think everybody else has. But that's not always the case, and I'm sure you fully understand that. So one thing I'm encouraging you to do, and we're going to do a little exercise here, is to take a moment to write out in a very specific format the values that you want people, how you want people to treat you in a meeting. What are things that you value? And so I'm going to ask that we get the board up here and see that. I'm going to get that here and see what kind of things do you value. There we go. Thank you. In having, if you have a meeting, grab a marker here. Oops. Don't want to lose all of that. If you're sitting in a meeting, what are things, how do you want to be treated when you're in that meeting? And let's see if I can make sure that this is being seen here. Okay. And how do you want to make sure that you're treated in that meeting? Um, as you think about that, and before you write your own down, I'm going to share a little bit with you. My husband worked in a congregation after we had, after leaving the congregation where we were working together. And he worked in another congregation in another area. And there was a person who was elected to chair the church council, the church board. But there was another person who was elected to be on that board council that had been used to being in charge of everything. And he always tried to take over and take charge during the meetings. And so that became very disruptive. And that's kind of one of the values to list. How do you expect to be treated as the person in charge? How do you expect, what are things that you expect if you're talking, do you want people at the other end of the table having their own little conversation about something that was said 5 minutes ago? Do you want people to be interrupting you? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about when to start and how long meetings should be and going on and on and on? Or having the meeting after the meeting? Has that ever happened? You know, where you finish the meeting and then there's this little meeting off to the side in the parking lot or something like that. How do you feel about those things? What are how do you as a faith leader want to be treated when you're in a meeting? And then think about, this would be a great exercise to think about, okay, how do those fit in with what you value and what you think about your faith? How do you, does interrupting and carrying on side conversations, is that in line with how you understand your faith? That would be a question. If people say, oh, I'm comfortable with doing that, what do you think about that? And then the other thing to do as you think about this and write these down. Just take a minute here as I'm talking and write some of these down for yourself on a piece of paper. And then I would encourage you to do this same sort of exercise with your church board, your church council, your whatever the leadership group is in your congregation. Do this same exercise. What are the things you value as a group to, as you work together? Because when we don't have those values clarified and put out there, that's when conflicts arise, that's when feelings get hurt and people feel misunderstood or not heard. Think about the power of doing this kind of thing with every committee, every group within your congregation. Think about the power of doing this maybe with the whole congregation. What are the things you value as a congregation? And instead of having those be implied, put them out there. And then talk about them. If this is what we value, what does that say about our faith? Or what does our faith say about the things that we value? If we say we value God's creation and then do things like never recycle things from meetings and congregational events and just throw it all in the garbage, what does that say about valuing God's creation? Are we living our values? And how do we do that? It's a very powerful exercise to think about the ways in which we do and do not honor those values. And And then another thing to think about in all of this is, and I'm going to leave this here for right now, but how do we think about the things from the past? How do we incorporate the values from the past, or do we? Do we even know some of those stories and some of those values from the past? The congregation I served with my husband, where we were in a team ministry, I found out a story of something that happened over 100 years previously in the congregation. Well, I knew part of it. I shouldn't say I found out the whole thing. I knew part of it. We were serving a congregation in the South, and in, I think it was 1864 or 5, the church building burned. And when I first found that out, I assumed it had something to do with the war, the Civil War at that point in time. And then I found out that no, it wasn't as a result of, well, it wasn't directly a result of the war. There had been a dispute between two members in the congregation. And I don't have any clue what that dispute was about, but one of the parties got angry and decided to take matters into his own hands. And he hired, in this case, a black person, a black man, probably a former slave, to burn the church. And that man just could not, or was told not, to leave the Bible, the altar Bible in the church, or the communion ware. And that was taken out and hidden in the woods. Well, that got found. And when it was found, everybody understood, yeah, this isn't exactly an accident at that point. Now, I have no idea what happened to, unfortunately, to the black man who was the one who ignited the fire. And I don't even know what happened to the person who paid for it, so to speak, that happening. Legally, I don't know what happened to them. But that was the extent of the story I knew. And that was the extent of the story that was known by the members of the congregation. And this was a congregation where generations were part of this congregation. And then one day, one of the older members of the congregation, somebody who was kind of a historian in the congregation, told me that his father had known who it was that burnt the church. Not the black man, but the member who had been angry and had started the fire. And the gentleman who was talking with me said he had asked his father who this was. But his father refused to tell him, because he said there were still descendants of that man in the congregation. And he did not want them to be labeled with what their ancestor had done. I don't know if any of them knew what their ancestor had done. And so that gentleman took that knowledge with him to the grave in order to keep from passing on a hurtful thing that had happened. It was an act of grace and an act of forgiveness. That was part of the story that was not known in the congregation. And I asked the gentleman who told me if I could share that in a sermon, and he said yes. When I did share that in a sermon, that was, I can tell you, there was silence, because nobody else knew this, that part of the story. And I shared it in a sermon at a time when the congregation was going through an incident that was very divisive. a few years before this sermon, somebody had been buried in the church cemetery, a 45-year-old gentleman who was the spouse of a member, and another member had objected to where this man was buried, saying that was in part of his family's plot. And he had brought a lawsuit, this gentleman who objected to the burial. He was suing the congregation and the widow of this man. And we were a couple of years into this process. The congregation had gone through non-binding arbitration, and then it had become a full-blown lawsuit. And it was, how are we going to deal with this? What are the values we have as a congregation? How do we deal with something so big and so divisive? It threatened to split the congregation apart. And I shared that story about the gentleman taking the name of somebody to the grave with him so that their ancestors would not bear the mantle and be stigmatized by what their ancestor had done. I shared that story during the middle of this lawsuit as not as speaking to any person about the lawsuit, but about the value of forgiveness and the value of how this congregation behaved in the past, a value that they had that was part of the history of the congregation. But it was almost lost. It was almost lost because that story was not shared. That value was not shared, which was part of that story. And I can't say for sure, but I think that story being out there has been part of the healing that has happened over time within that congregation, even after my husband and I left, and even after that lawsuit was finally settled, and the deceased gentleman was allowed to lie in peace where he was, and things were arranged for the family that was upset about that. And those kinds of things, those stories, I started by telling my story and the painful parts of that story. And we don't always tell that for our faith communities too. We don't always know those stories. And when those stories, those incidents in our stories get lost in our own personal stories or in a faith community story, the values that are there get lost. The lessons that are there that get lost. And we can't grow from them. We cannot move forward from those times. Knowing the values, your own personal values, and the congregation talking about their values helps us define why we do what we do, why we want to move somewhere, why we have this vision, this dream, why we think bigger. Those values are very, very important. They're fundamental to who we are. And yet so often we just don't, we don't think about them as individual things. We don't delineate them and put them down. And it is really important that we do that. So it's important for us as individuals, and it's also important for your congregation, your faith community, as to why you do what you do. Why does your congregation exist? Sometimes we call that a mission statement. Now, I've read mission statements from congregations before, and I had I've had to laugh, and just smile at some of them because they're so long. And one of them was a paragraph. Nobody, I read it and I had a hard time figuring out what in the world they were saying. And so nobody in the congregation would understand it either. Yeah, it said some nice things and all of that and good theology, but it really didn't answer, why are we here now? What is it we're about? What is it we value? What is God doing through us in this place, in this time? Not just what happened in the past, not just a big, long theological statement. Yeah, the theology's there, but why here? Why now? Who are you? What does it matter that your congregation exists? Do the people around your congregation know you're there? And if they do, what do they think about you? What do you want them to think about you? What do you want them to know about who you are? And do you live those values in the midst of the community that you exist in? That's so important. How you put those values out. And all of that helps to break the cycle of your congregation thinking small. You put it down on paper, you get it out to the people. Who are you? What are you about? Why? There are people who are writing books these days about the power of why, knowing your why. And it's so very important for us as a congregation to share God's love. Okay, great. How do you do that? What does that mean here, now, with who you are, in your place, your time? It's a good general statement, but be specific about it. And, what is it you need to do with all of that? How do you delineate that? How can you work with your congregation to do that? That's a part of breaking the small thinking. That's a part of helping people think bigger. These are the things we've always done. Great. Are they the important things to be doing now? Or maybe there's something else that God is calling your congregation to be about. Here and now. What are those things? You can't just assume that people understand or know what they are. You may not have an idea, but that doesn't mean anybody else has an idea. So work to think about how that happens and how to get that, how to do that, how to work within your congregation, your faith community, to bring this out. It can start small by asking questions in your board meetings, your council meetings, your committee meetings, and get people to start thinking about that. So what do you need at this time and place to move forward? What do you need to move away from? And what does your community value that you need to build on? What are those values? And I'm going to write that on here. I'm not used to writing on a board that much, so my handwriting is not the greatest. What do you need to move away from? And what do you need to build? Question mark. I love this board because I can raise it up. That's one of the coolest things I've ever seen, to have this board like this. So what do you need to move away from? And what do you need to build? as a community of faith. There's the story for ourselves, but also if you're in a congregation or in any kind of organized setting, what are you moving away from? What do you need to break, to build? So I want you to take a couple of minutes here just to think about that. We're going to take a pause and give you 5 minutes. We'll just give you 5 minutes to pause and think about this, and just on your own, on a piece of paper, just take a little time to write. And you can continue doing this at another time. You've got these questions, so just think about that and make sure you work on these things. But I want to go on to something else here, and it's more about your story. And when I started telling you my story at the very beginning. Typically, the first part was, the typical kind of introduction. But then I told you my story about leaving, even though I didn't want to at the time, a congregation where I was in ministry. And the wins that came as a result of that. And I want to help you learn a little bit about how to start to work on your own story. Because I said that's so important. If we're going to help our congregations tell their story and learn from their past and everything, we need to start learning and telling our story as well. So, owning your story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's something I have learned from my mentor and coach, Tiffany Largy, and it's something that I find extremely powerful, and I just want to help get it out there to the world so that you can experience the power of that and how God can work through you sharing your story about who you are and what's happened in your own life. And there are 3 parts to your story. Any good story has 3 parts. There's the beginning, and the beginning is always the setting of the story. For me, in my story, it was about 5 years into my second call, the second position I was in, and what was happening. Who's in the story? It was me. It was also the new senior pastor who had come to this congregation, and that's the beginning of the story is who's involved and kind of when it was. 5 years into my second position, and the people who are involved. Occasionally, it might be the where that this happened, but that just basically the very nuggets of your story in that. And then there's the middle. The middle of any story is the part that has the meat of the story in it, the problem. If it's a detective story, it's what happened and starting to try to figure out who done it. I happen to like Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and so it's always what happened to the person and the beginning of trying to find out who done it. And so the middle is, in this case, it's where is the problem? That kind of crisis moment. What happened in that? For me, it was being told I had a choice of either being fired or resigning. And either way, I was terminated. That was the issue. That was the reality. And either way, I was leaving that congregation. Didn't matter which one I chose. Well, it mattered to me which one I chose, but it's still what meant I was leaving the congregation. And what I felt, I was devastated. I was ashamed. I felt like my ministry was ruined and over and done with, and I was on the verge of leaving ministry. That's the heart of that story. That's the power of it, the middle of it. And I definitely felt like I wasn't good enough. A failure in all of that. But then there's the end. And sometimes we get so absorbed in the middle that we miss this part of the end. The end is where we win. The end is where the detective gets the person and captures whoever they are. The end is where we talk about our quantifiable wins. And a quantifiable win is a very special kind of win. It's not just, oh, I went on to serve more years in ministry. It's not just, I was happy about something. It's something that's measurable. For me, those wins have included, going on to becoming the first pastor assigned and not assigned, who became certified in a couple of things. For me, wins have been mentoring 14 seminary students. So it doesn't always have to include things in ministry, but a win can also include just the floor plan, designing the floor plan for my house. It includes the radio show that I've been doing. Who knew I would ever be doing a radio show? I didn't ever foresee that in my future. But those are all wins. And so we're about coming to a point here where I want to have you start thinking about your wins. What are they? What were those wins? And I encourage you really to think about, try to find at least 10 of them. When I sat down first to do this, I was like, wins in ministry? You got to be kidding me. You could be, how many people, if you started a new congregation, that can be a win. If your congregation has grown by a number of people, that can be a win. Those can be wins, yes, in ministry, but much of ministry is not a quantifiable win, is the quantity of something or specific. So you might have to think about this. What are the things that you have done? You personally, not what's happened in the congregation, not, you helped X number of people. That's great. If you built a counseling ministry, that could be a quantifiable win. But, you know, yeah, I had 14 funerals in 3.5 months. Yeah, but what are things that you have done? And again, this goes back to that time we're thinking about we often put ourselves last, which I mentioned at the beginning, where we think that, you know, we are, how should I say this? That we're not that important. So the things that we do, the things that we might call a win, that they're not important enough to really be noticed, but they are. That's God's action through you. And it's not the number of people you saved, no. It's how many, you know, what are other things that you've done? Things that you can quantify in some, you know, that are measurable in some way. Somebody can say, go and say, yes, that happened. Yes, that was done. So we're going to take a bit of a break here and at some point, and I'm not exactly sure how we're doing here, you know, thinking about, let's take a 15-minute break and have you think about those wins and what that means and where you're going with that. So we'll take that break and try to, like I said, try to come up with at least 10 wins. So see you back in 15 minutes.